Hello, my name is Luke Licky. Today I will be doing my presentation on the Great Northern War. So this war is also known as the Second Northern War. There was one prior to this, but most people call it the Great Northern War. So this war is so important because it changed the balance of power in the region, not only in the region, but as the continent as a whole. At the end, Europe's newest and most militarized powers lay in ruin. That was Sweden. And Russia rose from the ashes to start its explosive rise to dominance. So the countries that were involved were Denmark, Norway, Poland, and Russia, and they all challenged Swedish control in an anti-Swedish coalition. So these were not all the countries involved or all the states. Finland was involved in some way, but it was more under the Swedish control, so I'm not going to include it. So you might be wondering what Sweden could have done to make this many countries so mad. So this goes back a century, it's about a century and a half before the war started. So in 1560 to 1658, Sweden gained lands in Germany, Norway, and Denmark. And so for the entire century, they went on a conquering rampage, claiming every land they could possibly see or obtain. So this left many countries with a grudge against Sweden, and so they wanted to reclaim their land for strategic advantage and their own pride. And they also saw the dangers of letting Sweden gain too much land. So Sweden may have been dominant power in Northern and Eastern Europe, but the supremacy in the Baltics was incomplete. They didn't have complete control of the Baltics, and they craved that. So Charles XI reformed the Swedish army 30 years prior to the war. So in 1670, he completely redid the army and made it new with new strategies and made it extremely powerful force. Charles XI died in 1697, and he left his own 15-year-old son as king, known as Charles XII. Peter I of Russia and Christian V of Denmark saw this as an ideal opportunity to exploit an obvious weakness of having a young and inexperienced ruler. So in April of 1699, Russia and Denmark concluded a treaty of mutual assistance in future wars against Sweden. So pretty much what this means is in the future, if there were to be war, they would team up. Shortly after the Denmark Treaty, Peter concluded a treaty with Augustus of Saxony, who was elected ruler of Poland. Poland was known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the time. So now Peter of Russia has an alliance with Denmark and Poland. So Sweden had gained Livonia in 1629 through a treaty. This treaty took Livonia from Poland. The treaty assured that Livonian nobility would preserve their rights and their freedoms. Everything was fine until Charles X chose not to be as lenient. He chose to revoke 1/4 of Livonia's nobility's land. This never happened because of the First Great War. Charles XI turned his father's ideas into reality, and by the time of his death, Livonian nobility had held only 1/5 of their states. One noble under the name of Johann Reinhold Patkul was absolutely outraged. He agitated nobility to rise up against Sweden in a rebellion. Consequently, he was arrested and sentenced to death, but he ended up avoiding his execution and fled Sweden to safety. Patkul later played a key role in the formation of the anti-Swedish coalition, as he was the diplomatic link between Peter, Augustus, and Christian, the entire anti-Swedish coalition. And he provided intelligence on Swedish defenses in the Baltic. So sensing the impending danger, Charles XII sent diplomats to Russia in 1699 as an attempt for peace. Peter I, being a skillful and confident diplomat, assured peaceful intentions, but in reality, he decided to go to war. Augustus of Poland also sent diplomats to Sweden, assuring the king of his friendly intentions. While Augustus and Peter were both being friendly, they were secretly planning the preparations for war. So if you look at this map, we can see how far the Swedish control has gone. It pretty much controls all of the Baltic regions. Russia does have some, but is pretty much obsolete because of the naval supremacy that Sweden has. So naval strength is so essential for maintaining stability within the region. It allows you to control the waters and control the trade within the waters. Russia's navy absolutely paled in comparison to the Swedish. The only ones that could really rival against Swedish navy was England, but they were removed from the war at this point. So I like to split up this war into 4 main periods. And what I mean by that, there's 4 main periods of conflicts and a decisive string of victories that really changed the outcome of the war. So one thing I like to add is that standing armies did not exist in this time period, meaning that you had to take time to build up and recruit an army. meaning that if your army was destroyed, you would have to go home and take time to rebuild your army. So, war begins as Frederick of Denmark moves his army into Holsten. This was the first act of war, and it was completely unprovoked. Months later, Peter the Great led his Russian army and laid siege to Narva up in Estonia. Narva is going to be the red arrow, and Holsten is going to be the yellow one. So, Charles attacked Frederick's army in Holsten and completely destroyed the Denmark army, or the Danish army. And in one decisive battle, he was able to completely withdraw Denmark from the war and the coalition. Without stopping, Charles marched his forces to Narva to face off against Peter. The surprise of the Swedish army led to the absolute destruction of the Russian army, and this defeat put a damper on the Russian advances for years. So you would think after 2 successful campaigns against Denmark and Russia, Charles would slow down. But he immediately confronted the Polish and the Saxons. He was determined to get rid of Augustus, the king of Poland, and spent 6 years trying to fight him. While Russia was still recuperating from their loss at Narva, Charles was able to beat the Polish and made Augustus relinquish his crown. So Charles had now knocked out 2 opposing countries out of the war without suffering major losses in about 6 years. So now his only major enemy was going to be Russia at this point. So the second period begins in 1707 when the Swedish resumed their attacks on Russia. However, Russia in the past 6 years, where Charles was headhunting Augustus, was able to rebuild their army and was much stronger than it was before. So after the winter, the Swedish marched down towards Poltava. Their military reputation was something to be feared, and the soldiers were filled with self-esteem. So we can see where Sweden is up on the north of the map, and the yellow arrow is going to be Poltava, where they marched down towards. So this leads us into the Battle of Poltava. Charles XII led an army of 22,000 men to attack at a supply depot with a small force. Peter approached attackers from behind with an army of 44,000 men and established elaborate fortifications. Charles was on the bench due to an infected injury and that he had received from scouting missions. Charles was a very brave leader who fought on the front lines. So this was extremely inspirational for his men. When his second in command wasn't able to inspire the same amount of courage that Charles was, the army took a big hit. So the Swedes had to advance 656 yards under heavy artillery fire to reach the Russian position from whence they were cornered in. Once they reached the Russian infantry, they were outnumbered 2-1. So Sweden suffered a heavy defeat, but was worse with a blow to their ego. Before, they were seen as an indomitable force, crushing everything in their way, but that had completely changed. And Peter's win marked the arrival of Russia as a major military force in Europe. So the third period begins as the coalition was revived after the Battle of Poltava and began seizing many Swedish territories along the coast. So now Denmark and Poland have both gotten themselves back in the war after giving time to recuperate. So the coalition pushes up north towards Sweden and Finland, and the Russians defeat the Swedes in a naval battle at Hanko. And this decisive victory completely cut off Sweden from Finland, one of their main supporters, and also gave them access to the Åland Islands. So the fourth and final period. This is where Sweden had been backed into the corner and they had to start looking for negotiations. Russia and Sweden managed to find peace for a very short period of time. But it does get much worse for Sweden. In 1718, Charles desperately invaded southern Norway and was subsequently killed in the Battle of Frederiksskjold. And so now the peace that Charles had made was gone, but Charles has no heirs to the throne. So his sister, Eleonora, succeeded his throne. She attempted to fight back, but Russia squashed a series of conflicts between the Swedish, so they looked for peace. As a consequence of their loss, Sweden ceded Bremen to Hanover and gave up Stettin to Prussia. The Swedish also ceded Ingria, Estonia, Livonia, and a strip of the Finnish coast to Russia. This is a huge gain for Russia. So, Sweden had been crushed by the coalition and lost many of their territories they spent the last century accumulating. Sweden had lost super supremacy in the Baltic region and was replaced by Peter the Great's reign. This victory for Russia cemented them as the owners of the Baltic region and a formidable force in Europe. Without this victory, Russia would never be as powerful as they were today. So, if the outcome of this war had been different, we might see Sweden as a much larger country today with much more territory. But Russia was able to smartly build up alliances with other countries in Europe and knock out Sweden. Sweden was threatening every other country's freedom, and so they decided to act as one and take out King Charles XII. Okay, this is my bibliography, and that concludes my presentation. I appreciate it. Thank you.